When men fear death, death has great power. Oh, okay. Let's try monitoring that. Too loud. Okay. Okay. When men fear death, death has great power over them. If they see death as a mockery of life and meaning, and as the reduction to absurdity of all man's hopes and plans, then death for them is the great evil rather than sin. The result is a radical inversion of the order of reality. To understand this, let us examine St. Paul's statement in Romans 5:11-13. Quote, "And not only so, but we also joy in God through our Lord Jesus Christ, by whom we have now received the atonement. Wherefore, as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin, and so death passed upon all men, for that all have sinned. For until the law sin was in the world, but sin is not imputed when there is no law." End quote. St. Paul here declares in verse 11 that, being reconciled to God, we glory or rejoice in him. In Hodge's words, quote, "Salvation is begun on earth," end quote. Sin invaded, quote, "the world," end quote, through Adam, quote. Sin existed before the fall of Adam. It can only mean the world of mankind. Sin entered the world. It invaded the race, end quote. The penal consequence of sin was death. All the race is subject to penal evils on account of Adam. How was this possible when as yet the law had not been yet given through Moses? A basic principle of law is that where there is no law, there is no legal offence. Paul recognizes this. Until the law of Moses was given, Until the law of Moses was given, there was, however, sin in the world. This means that there was clearly a law, because otherwise, quote, "Sin is not imputed when there is no law," verse 13. As Hodge noted, quote, "If men were sinners and were treated as such before the law of Moses, what's that noise? Hello, this is Nathan. Thanks for joining me in the booth. I really hope you're enjoying the live streams and videos. To find out more about this narration project, or to make a donation, go to nathanteacher.com. Thanks. As Hodge noted, quote, "If men were sinners and were treated as such before the law of Moses, it is certain that there is some other law for the violation of which sin was imputed to them." End quote. The antinomians have long used this verse to impugn the law, whereas it confirms the law. God imputed sin to Cain and to the entire world outside of Noah's family in the judgment of the flood. Clearly, there was not only an oral revelation already given to men, but also the fact that, because man is God's creature, the law, like God's total witness, is made known to man in every aspect of creation and in every atom of man's being. Romans 1:18-21. Thus, in every age and place when man has sinned, he has sinned with knowledge, and the consequence has been death and judgment. Man, however, refuses to see his sin as sin. He may groan inwardly because of the judgment of sin, but outwardly Sin for him is freedom, freedom from God. Thus, in the eyes of fallen man, it is not sin which is evil, but rather death. It is death, not sin, which fallen man fears, because death looms. It is death, not sin, which fallen man fears, because death looms as judgment on his sin, and death puts an end to all his attempts to play God. Age and death place a limitation on his ability to commit physical sins, such as adultery, and age and death remind him of the futility of all his hopes of his very life. Since fallen man sees death as the great evil for himself, he also sees death as a way of salvation to rid him of his enemies. If death is the greatest evil for himself, it is surely so for his enemies also. Thus, the way to confound his enemies is to kill them, and the way to triumph is to stay alive while killing one's enemies. In such thinking, death acquires a double meaning. It is the great and final evil where it affects oneself. It is salvation when it eliminates one's enemies. Death looms all the larger when it assumes this double role. A very simple illustration of this will show what results. An earnest conservative admitted that, during the 1930s and the early 1940s, he believed very strongly that most of the world's problems could be eliminated and the world made a vastly better place if death suddenly took three men: Stalin, Hitler, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Stalin, as the communist dictator, was murdering millions of Russians and guiding the massive subversion of all other countries. Hitler was a threat of war, had revived and farmed racial fand. I've never met a farmer of racial hatred. Had revived and fanned racial hatred and was leading Germany to barbarism. Roosevelt was seducing the United States into socialism and worldwide interventionism, and was likely to use war as a way out of the Depression and as an opportunity to become a world leader. Without in any degree having any desire to be an assassin, this man all the same longed for the death of these men as his answer to world problems. It was no small shock to this man to find, when all three men were dead, that the world were... Three men were dead. That the world not only did not improve, but also was far worse, and yet very happy with its wayward course. He remarked, quote, "I finally gave up hoping death would settle world affairs when it dawned on me that it would mean the death of practically all men, and maybe myself." End quote. Death as an answer to man's problems is an idea which has long been familiar to suicides and murderers. It has been a commonplace idea in every quarter. The short story writer Hector Hugo Munro Saki The short story writer Hector Hugh Munro Saki, 1870 to 1916, had a character in one of his stories observe, quote, "Waldo is one of those people who would be enormously improved by death." End quote. One of George Herbert's outlandish proverbs of 1640 speaks of, quote, "waiting for dead men's shoes." End quote. Death as a means of advantage has long been prominent in men's thoughts. Add to this a belief that life is meaningless, and human life becomes trivial in the roll call of death. Lawrence Sterne depicted this as a father meditates on his son's death in The Life and Opinions of Tristan Shandy. Quote, "Philosophy has a fine saying for everything. For death it has an entire set. The misery was, they all at once rushed into my father's head. 'Tis an inevitable chance, the first statute in Magna Carta It is an everlasting act of Parliament, my dear brother, almost die. If my son could have died. If my son could not have died, it had been matter of wonder, not that he is dead. What has become, brother Toby, of Nineveh and Babylon, of Cisium and Mytilene, Cisium, Cyzicum, Mytilene, of Cyzicum and Mytilene? The fairest towns that ever the sun rose upon are now no more. The names only are left, and those, for many of them are wrongly spelt, are falling themselves piecemeal to decay, and in length of time will be forgotten, and involved with everything in a perpetual night. The world itself, brother Toby, must come to an end. What flourishing towns now prostrate upon the earth? Alas, alas, said I to myself, that man should disturb his soul for the loss of a child, when so much as this lies awfully buried in his presence. Remember, said I to myself again, remember thou art a man. End quote. The life of a child is nothing when cities and civilizations in great numbers have died. Even more when millions have been brutally killed and have been buried and forgotten by history. Their pain and meaning are alike gone, and in this view it is nothing if other men suffer today, if some advantage accrues to someone. People are there to be used by such a man. Principles mean nothing to the man for whom life means nothing. It is significant that both Stalin and some of his associates had been double agents before, and in some cases during the Russian Revolution. They worked for the Tsarist secret police and for the revolution, enjoying the power and the destructive potential in their dual role. It is more than likely that, however much the cause of Marxism meant to them, the power their role gave them over other men was even more compelling. If and when the records of subversion within the Soviet Union become a matter of public record, they will no doubt demonstrate the ease with which prominent communists have played a double role in order to enhance their power over men's lives. Stalin's daughter had recorded the fact that Beria had a long history as a double agent during the Civil War in the Caucasus. He was a born... is this a quote? Not sure. Okay, we're gonna quote. Quote. He was born... Hello? Quote. He was a born spy and provocateur. He worked first for the Dashnakists. He worked first for the Dashnakists, the Armenian nationalists, and then for the Reds as power swung back and forth. Once the Reds caught him in the act of treason and had him arrested, he was in prison awaiting sentence when a telegram arrived from Kirov, who was chief of all operations in the Caucasus, demanding that he be shot as a traitor. Just then, however, the fighting started up again, and he was such a small fry that nobody got around to dealing with him. But all the old Bolsheviks in the Caucasus knew of the telegram's existence, and Beria himself knew of it. Isn't it perhaps here that one should seek an explanation of Kirov's murder many years later? It was right after Kirov's murder in 1934, after all, that Beria began his climb to prominence and power. End quote. There's a very revealing letter from Stalin to his daughter, a tender note to Dear Svetochka, Dear Svetochka, Dear Svetochka, Svetochka. Dear Svetochka. Hello, hello, no, hello. Dear Svetochka, which reads in part, quote, take care of yourself. Take care of your daughter too. This state needs people, even those who are born prematurely. Your little papa. End quote. This affectionate letter is all the more telling in that it reveals how deeply imbued Stalin was with an instrumental view of man. The state needs people. When men are seen as instruments of the state, they are very readily used because it is the function of an instrument to be used. Samuel Foote, 1720 to 1777, wrote in The Minor, quote, death and dice level all distinctions. End quote. Death and dice are thus linked, implying that chance rules all, and all distinctions and meaning are wiped out by death. If after death man has no meaning, why should he have meaning before death? Death thus represents the great evil and the great power. It is both damnation when it strikes the godless man and salvation when he himself employs it. Death, rather than sin, is for him the greatest evil to befall a man. In terms of this faith, it is better to be red than dead, better to be conquered alive by the worst enemy than to risk death resisting him. Where death, rather than sin, is the great evil, there pacifism will flourish, since man would rather risk slavery than death. Similarly, war will flourish most where death is the greatest. Similarly, war will flourish most where death is the greater evil than sin, because death will represent a culminating power which men will as readily use as they will readily deplore. This, then, is the dual role of death for the unregenerate, to be the greatest evil and also to be a means of salvation, to be dreaded personally, but desired intensely for others. A thoughtless and immoral man who had long been faithless to his wife and contemptuous of her faith and patience was suddenly laid low by a stroke. Knowing that he would die, he screamed pornographic insults at his wife, resenting the fact that she would live and... hello. Blow. Hello. Knowing that he would die, he screamed pornographic insults at his wife, resenting the fact that she would live and would live freedom and with freedom. Resenting the fact that she would live and would with freedom enjoy his wealth. The dying man had one prayer, that he would become suddenly well long enough to kill her before he died. An ancient Greek verse, an inscription from the tomb of Timon, gives us the same mood. Quote, ask neither my name nor my country, passers-by. My sole wish is that all of you may die. End quote. St. Paul's order is the right one. It puts the problem in perspective. By sin came death. Christ came to overthrow the power of sin and rendered perfect obedience to the law of God, and he then overthrew the power of death. Hello. And he then overthrew the power of death in his resurrection. Man in Christ is called to obey the law of God, and by means of it to establish dominion over the earth. Christ shall reign in and through his people, and shall put all his enemies under his feet, in subjection to himself and to the saints. Then the last or final enemy, death, shall be destroyed at the end, and the fullness of the new creation ushered in. 1 Corinthians 15, 24-26. prior to that time, quote, "He shall have put down all rule and all authority and power. Sin shall have been destroyed in principle by his atoning death and resurrection, and in its controlling power by the sanctification of men and nations. Death, then, as the final or remaining enemy, shall be destroyed." Doing my best. Doing my best here. Okay. What? 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 Oh, what a headache. Nightmare. All right, see you soon. Well done for listening right to the end. If you would like to know more about this important Christian audiobook project, please go to nathanteacher.com. Thanks.